There are moments in geopolitics where the rules quietly shift, not with a declaration, not with a press release, but with a single sentence spoken into a microphone by someone who has clearly made up their mind. This was one of those moments. 3 words: calm, deliberate, final. And when Ursula von der Leyen said them in front of the European Parliament, every trader watching from Frankfurt to Chicago already knew something had fundamentally changed. The words were not a warning. They were not an invitation to negotiate. They were the close of one chapter and the violent opening of another. And what followed in the next 72 hours would force Washington, Wall Street, and every American corporation operating on European soil to confront a question they had assumed would never arrive. What happens when Brussels stops asking nicely? To understand the full weight of what just happened, you need to understand something that doesn't make for a great headline but matters enormously. This response was not improvised. It was not a reaction born out of panic or wounded pride. It was the product of years of quiet, methodical preparation. And the moment it was deployed, it exposed how badly the Trump administration had misread the room it thought it understood completely. Let's go back to April 2nd, 2025, the day the White House named Liberation Day and announced a sweeping restructuring of American trade policy: a 10% baseline tariff on all foreign imports, a 20% specific rate directed at European Union goods, and a rhetorical framing that wasn't a bargaining position, it was a verdict. Trump stood in the Rose Garden and delivered what sounded like a closing argument, not an opening bid. He used the word reciprocal so many times that economists began keeping count. He told the world that Europe had been extracting wealth from the United States for decades and that this era of patience was finished. What he conspicuously did not mention, not once, was that the United States runs a substantial surplus with the European Union in services, digital infrastructure, insurance and financial products, intellectual property licensing, the invisible economy through which American corporations earn enormous revenues from European customers, entirely untouched by the new tariff architecture. The tariffs were designed to punish European manufacturers while leaving American service giants completely shielded. Inside Brussels, the senior trade team around von der Leyen had already gamed this scenario. They had modeled a 20% tariff event in November of the previous year. They ran the numbers again in February. They understood the specific damage vectors. German automakers exporting approximately 800,000 vehicles annually to the US, operating on margins that simply cannot absorb a 20% import duty without either price increases or production cuts. French luxury goods producers, Italian agricultural exporters, Irish pharmaceutical plants that quietly supply a significant share of America's generic drug market. The vulnerabilities were mapped. The pain was calculable. What changed after April 2nd was that von der Leyen decided the pain would no longer be absorbed quietly while diplomats worked the phones. This time, the pain would travel in both directions. The philosophy behind Europe's response is worth understanding because it's not what most people assume when they hear the phrase trade retaliation. The conventional image is a simple mirror. You put a tariff on our steel, we put a tariff on your steel, dollar for dollar, blow for blow. That's not what Valdis Dombrovskis designed. Dombrovskis, the Latvian economist who serves as the European Commission's executive vice president for trade, has been building something far more precise over the past several years. The framework he operates from is called strategic vulnerability targeting. The core principle is this: instead of matching your opponent's volume, you identify the industries and political geographies where your opponent is most exposed, and you concentrate your countermeasures there. You don't try to win on scale. You win by making the political cost of continuing higher than the political cost of backing down. Europe, commanding a consumer market of 450 million people and holding dominant global purchasing power across sectors from commercial aviation to agricultural commodities, had enormous leverage available to use this way. The question that had always lingered, since at least 2022, was whether the political unity required to actually deploy that leverage could ever be assembled across a bloc of 27 member states with deeply divergent interests and relationships with Washington. April 2025 answered that question in a way nobody in the Trump administration had modeled for. When von der Leyen took the podium in Strasbourg on April 9th, what she delivered was by most accounts the most aggressive trade speech ever given by a sitting European Commission president. She did not offer face-saving language. She did not dangle a return to dialogue as a carrot. She did not soften the announcement with diplomatic cushioning. She stated plainly that the European Union had extended good faith, that the response to that good faith had been escalation, and that the bloc would now use every instrument available under international trade law to defend its economic interests. Then she named the targets. A 50% retaliatory tariff on American bourbon, aimed at one of the most symbolically American exports on the planet. Tariffs on American motorcycles, specifically calibrated to strike Harley-Davidson and the Wisconsin legislative districts woven into its economic orbit. Tariffs on American soybeans, the agricultural heartland that forms the electoral foundation of Trump's political coalition, and a closing of existing loopholes that had allowed certain American steel and aluminum exports to continue entering European markets below the tariff threshold. Each of those was significant, but it was the final item on the list that sent real alarm through Washington because it had never been used before. The anti-coercion instrument, passed by the European Parliament in 2023, is a legal mechanism that allows the European Commission to restrict foreign access to European public procurement contracts when a trading partner is determined to be using economic pressure as a form of political coercion. European public procurement is worth north of 2 trillion euros annually. American defense contractors, cloud computing companies, software platforms, infrastructure firms, all of them compete for pieces of that market. The anti-coercion instrument, if fully activated, doesn't impose a tariff, it imposes a designation, and that designation could effectively shut American corporations out of contracts worth billions, not because of pricing or performance, but because their government chose a policy. That's a different kind of weapon. It hits corporate earnings directly. And it does so in a way that creates an immediate constituency of American business leaders with a personal financial incentive to pressure Washington to back down. The history of the instrument matters here. Dombrovskis began developing it in 2022 under the public framing that it was a tool aimed primarily at China. The legislation was carefully worded to apply to any trading partner using economic measures for political pressure. No country was named explicitly. But according to multiple accounts from inside the Commission, the stress testing scenarios used internally were modeled consistently on American behavior patterns, not Chinese ones. The instrument was not built for China. It was built for this exact moment. And it sat quietly for 2 years while von der Leyen's team attempted dialogue because they were waiting for three conditions to align: legal justification, political unity across member states, and a moment where deploying it would carry maximum impact. All three arrived in April 2025. The assumption the Trump administration had built its entire strategy around was that Europe would fracture, that Hungary, with its persistent alignment to American political conservatism under Viktor Orban, would obstruct the response. That smaller Eastern European nations dependent on American security guarantees would refuse to endorse economic confrontation with their primary military partner, that Italy would hesitate, that internal divisions would produce delay, and that Brussels would ultimately splinter before it could mount anything coherent. This assumption was stated openly by American trade officials. It was repeated as conventional wisdom across financial media. It was, as it turned out, completely wrong. Orban, who had spent years cultivating his image as the European politician closest to Trump, and who had blocked or delayed dozens of EU decisions on Ukraine, Russia, and NATO over the previous 4 years, went quiet. He did not endorse von der Leyen's package. He also did not block it. And under European Union rules, where qualified majority voting applies to trade countermeasures, silence from Hungary was legally sufficient. The story behind that silence emerged in fragments. On April 4th, 5 days before von der Leyen's speech in Strasbourg, a private meeting took place in Budapest. Dombrovskis flew there. The details of what was offered in that room have not been made public. But within 72 hours of that conversation, Hungary's formal position shifted from active opposition to abstention. Dombrovskis was on a flight back to Brussels the same night. Von der Leyen's Strasbourg address was scheduled 3 days later. The sequencing was surgical. The Commission had identified the single obstacle capable of derailing their entire response, found a way to neutralize it through private diplomacy, and then moved with a speed that Brussels is not typically known for. The institution that American officials had spent years characterizing as slow, fractured, and incapable of decisive action had just outmaneuvered them at exactly the moment it mattered most. Markets registered the shift in real time. On April 9th, as von der Leyen was still at the podium, the euro strengthened against the dollar for a third consecutive session. European defense equities, already elevated by the bloc's military spending surge, extended gains. American bourbon futures on the Chicago Exchange dropped sharply as traders priced in the incoming 50% tariff. Harley-Davidson stock fell 4% in a single afternoon. The soybean market entered its steepest single-session decline in 14 months. These were not symbolic tremors. They were the financial system's real-time assessment of who held the stronger position in this confrontation. And the verdict was not favorable to Washington. But none of those movements were the most significant market signal of that week. The most consequential shift happened in the bond market, specifically in the spread between American Treasury yields and German government bonds, which widened to levels not seen since 2011. What that spread communicates, in the cold arithmetic of institutional investment, is a growing perception that American fiscal policy has become less predictable and less trustworthy than European fiscal policy. That is not a small development. That is a structural shift in how global capital thinks about the United States as a haven. The dollar's global reserve status, its foundational role in international trade and finance, rests on a bedrock assumption of American stability and reliability. When bond markets start pricing American paper at a widening discount to German paper, something in that bedrock is moving. The corporate response was immediate and significantly not public. Within days of the Strasbourg speech, the CEOs of three major American pharmaceutical companies with European manufacturing operations reached out through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to ask what the administration's exit strategy looked like. Two large American cloud service providers with significant European public sector contract exposure began contingency planning for the scenario in which the anti-coercion instrument was fully activated against them. Boeing, which sells more commercial aircraft to European airlines than to any other regional market on Earth, issued a careful statement expressing hope that both sides would find a diplomatic resolution. Translated from the language of corporate communications, that statement meant, our European order book is in the crossfire and we are alarmed. None of these companies went public with their concerns, none of them openly pressured the White House. But the private communication channels to Washington were active, and the message being sent was the same from every direction. What is the plan? The Trump administration's public response to all of this was consistent with its style. A White House spokesperson called von der Leyen's speech reckless. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared on television and described Europe's countermeasures as self-destructive, arguing that European consumers would suffer more from a prolonged conflict than American producers would. At a fundraiser in Florida on April 11th, Trump told a crowd that von der Leyen's announcement was the desperate reaction of a failing political project, that Europe needed America far more than the reverse, and that no tariffs would come down until Europe agreed to terms set in Washington. The crowd cheered, the cameras rolled, and what Bessent pointedly did not address, what neither he nor any White House official addressed directly, was the timing structure embedded in the European response. Because von der Leyen had not simply announced what Europe would do, she had announced when, and the calendar she chose was not accidental. Stage 1 of the European countermeasures, May 1st, a date associated globally with labor and economic solidarity. Stage 2, July 4th, chosen with a symbolism so deliberate that even commentators sympathetic to the Trump administration had to acknowledge it on air. Stage 3, October, 6 weeks before the American midterm elections. Time to arrive at precisely the moment when the political cost of an unresolved trade war would be highest for Republican incumbents in agricultural states, manufacturing districts, and motorcycle country. This is not how Brussels normally operates. Brussels normally operates through committee cycles and consensus building and incremental process. What the European Commission deployed in April 2025 was something different. A precision instrument calibrated not just to cause economic damage, but to cause it at moments of maximum political sensitivity inside the United States. That is economic statecraft, and whoever designed the calendar, and the fingerprints are Dombrovskis's throughout, understood American domestic politics well enough to weaponize the electoral calendar against the people who had assumed European bureaucracy was too slow and too divided to function as a credible adversary. There is a broader question that runs beneath everything described here, and it is the question that global investors, multinational corporations, and foreign governments are now quietly but urgently working through. Is this the beginning of a sustained structural shift in the transatlantic economic relationship, or is it a crisis that will find resolution once the immediate political pressure creates enough incentive for both sides to step back? The honest answer is that no one knows. But the conditions that led here did not emerge from a single decision or a single administration. They have been building through cycles of American trade unilateralism, European frustration, and a gradual erosion of the institutional trust that the post-war economic order was built on. What the Liberation Day tariffs did was push a relationship that had been quietly deteriorating into open confrontation, and what Europe's response demonstrated is that the tools for that confrontation had been prepared and were ready. Dombrovskis, by all accounts, is not finished. The folder he opened after Trump's Florida fundraiser, the one containing the details of Stage 2, represents the next phase of a response designed to escalate in a controlled, legally grounded, politically targeted way, unless Washington changes course. It is not a bluff. The legal frameworks are in place. The political unity has been demonstrated. The corporate alarm signals are already traveling through private channels to the White House. The question is whether those signals will produce a course correction before the July 4th stage of the European response arrives, and before American companies with European exposure begin reporting the damage in their quarterly earnings calls. What happened in April 2025 between Washington and Brussels is not a trade dispute in the conventional sense. Conventional trade disputes involve negotiators arguing over tariff schedules and eventually meeting in the middle. What this is, what the timeline, the targeting, the legal architecture, and the calendar make unmistakably clear, is a deliberate, methodical application of economic pressure by a geopolitical bloc that spent years building the capacity to do exactly this, waiting for the moment when it would be both legally justified and politically unified, and then executing it with a precision that caught its intended target off guard. Europe did not snap. Europe arrived. It arrived with everything it had been quietly preparing, deployed with a discipline and a timing that Washington's own strategists, who had built their entire model around European fracture, did not anticipate and have not yet fully reckoned with. The most powerful sentence spoken in European politics this spring was 3 words long. What those 3 words set in motion, the legal machinery, the phased economic pressure, the corporate alarm, the bond market shift, the quiet diplomatic maneuvering in Budapest, is still unfolding, and the world's financial markets, watching in real time, are reaching a verdict that should concern Washington far more than any tariff schedule. They are beginning to bet on Brussels.